Good afternoon. Today our guest is former European Parliament Turkey Rapporteur Kati Piri, now Vice President S&D Group for Foreign Affairs, Human Rights, Security and Defense, Development Cooperation. We'll discuss the new refugee crisis. What will Europe do with Kati Piri? Ms. Piri, welcome to Medyascope.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you. European Union and Turkey have a new fresh migrant crisis. Thousands of migrants are gathered at Turkey's border with Greece after the Turkish government last week allowed the refugees' passage to Europe, saying it had reached its capacity. Yesterday, the heads, the presidents of European institutions went to the Greece-Turkey border with Greece Prime Minister Mitsotakis to show solidarity and determination to protect EU borders. So let's start with migrant deal. So it's a statement, not an agreement, which means it's not approved by European Parliament. Was the migrant deal appropriate from the beginning?
Well, Europe was facing a crisis. We already had, by the time we agreed this statement with Ankara, we already had seen 1.1 million asylum seekers entering the European Union. So it's true, it's the EU leaders who made this agreement with the Turkish government. It's not something that has been approved by European Parliament, but for sure in 2016 March, it stopped the smuggling of people onto the Greek islands, and it also, prevented more and more people from drowning. So I think in the end, it was necessary to make this agreement.
Okay, right now, European Union expects Turkey to uphold migrant deal. Why did you criticize this?
Because it sounds so easy just to say that Turkey should comply with the deal, where I think also the European Union was negligent with maintaining the deal. To be honest, in 2016, many promises were made, which the EU didn't keep because they were unrealistic from the start. And I will give you some examples. And on the other hand, the part of the deal which we did keep was the 6 billion euro of support for hosting the 3.7 million refugees inside Turkey. And the last months, although we know this funding is coming to an end, there has been no willingness from EU leaders to put new money on the table to continue to finance this type of projects. And to give you a couple of examples of what
please.
EU leaders promised in 2016, it was visa-free travel by the end of the year. It was large-scale resettlement. It was an upgrade of the customs union, and a quicker acceleration of Turkey into the EU. Now, I think these promises, to be honest, were unrealistic from the beginning, but the promises were made. And that's why I thought it's a little bit hypocritical of the EU to make statements that Turkey should abide by the statement, while we also see that at least the EU was not so enthusiastic to abide by its own commitments in the agreement.
Okay, then, you also say that no money has been reserved in multi-annual financial framework for its continuation. Can you please explain this?
Yes. So the promise that was made was 6 billion euros for 3 years. And the 3 years ended at the end of 2018. But what happened is that the money was less quickly dispersed than originally planned. So the EU has now committed all the 6 billion euros for the coming years, but the two of its biggest projects are coming to an end within a couple of months. For instance, the EU is co-financing the education for 500,000 Syrian children. This money ends in 6 months' time. Another project is the cash assistance card, which 1.7 million Syrians are receiving who live in Turkey. They get every month a certain amount of money put on this card. This project ends in the next 12 months. So these are two big projects which are very important, I think, flagship projects of how the EU is trying to support also the Turkish people with hosting the refugees. Now, as you know, the EU is negotiating its budget for the next 7 years. And to my big surprise, there is no money reserved for the continuation of this financing of refugees in Turkey for any of the next 7 years. So that is what I find a little bit hypocritical of the EU, to call on Turkey to respect the deal, but we ourselves did not take steps to continue the deal.
What may be the best solution for both sides?
Well, to be honest, definitely not the current situation.
Yeah.
On the one hand, using refugees as a blackmail measure, which the President Erdogan is doing now. We saw buses were rented in Istanbul to bring the people to the border. We see the state television in Turkey filming how refugees are leaving from the coast near Izmir to Greece. And on the other hand, we see the Greek police, how they are reacting at the border, shooting with tear gas, shooting with water cannons at vulnerable people. I think we see on both sides how refugees are being used in a political struggle. This is definitely not the answer to this crisis. I think despite the difficult circumstances between Ankara and Brussels, because yes, we do have many concerns about the human rights and rule of law situation inside Turkey, but we also have to acknowledge that the Turkish people for many years are hosting almost 4 million refugees, and there's another 1 million at the southern border right now because of the fighting ongoing in Idlib. So it's not more, as the European Union is not willing to host 4 million refugees, I think it's not more than natural that we discuss with Ankara how we can decently deal with caring for these refugees and also share the burden more equally.
Okay, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, defined Greece as a shield. And last week I was in Brussels. I talked with Commission spokesman Peter Stano. He also talked about protecting the European territory. When you look at the phrases that European leaders or European spokesmen use, what do you think about this?
I'm disgusted. I mean, how can you talk about a shield? This is not a war happening. This is not some kind of invasion happening. We're talking about vulnerable people who want to ask for asylum. Some are real refugees, some are not. But it doesn't mean that this is like a security threat for Europe. Of course, borders are important. And of course, let's be honest, the people who are now standing at the EU borders are not people like who are now fleeing from Idlib, who have to be afraid that a bomb is going to fall on their head if they not entered through the border. But, this is not the way to deal with any humanitarian crisis. I think it's funny to see how EU leaders were going to the border while we already have 300 journalists there. So I think, we already know what is happening there. It would have been more important that they go to the Greek islands. Because on the Greek islands, already until last week, there were 42,000 asylum seekers stuck. It's the Greek people on these islands who for 4.5 years are facing a real crisis. And if the European Union is really in solidarity with Greece, then we should have taken over and relocated some of these refugees to other European countries. And unfortunately, that statement I didn't hear yesterday by Commissioner President von der Leyen.
When you talk with people from Brussels, people say that European Union leaders and politicians are afraid of the rise of extreme right. That's why they cannot find the different solutions. Do you agree with this?
Well, yes, we saw that in 2015, 2016, that the extreme right got a lot of attention, and they even won some elections because of the migrant crisis. Now, that's not a reason to step away from our own values or to disregard international law. What is needed is that we show that this is not some uncontrolled thing which is happening. Yes, we can, in a humane way, keep control about who is entering Europe. It should not be smugglers who decide who is entering Europe. It should be based on asylum law. If a person is a refugee and asks for asylum in Europe, that person should receive asylum in Europe. Of course, that doesn't mean open borders. With open borders, there is no control. But if you respect international law and you find an opportunity to make good agreements, again, with the Turkish government on how to also help the Turkish population with healthcare, with education, with housing for the refugees, then I think no one, the extreme right cannot say this is an uncontrollable situation. They're talking always about tsunamis, about invasions happening. They're actually fueling the fear of people when they see uncontrolled situation. No one wants to go back to the situation like we had in 2015.
So let's take a look at Turkish side. Until last week, did Turkey uphold the deal? What were the main problems?
And what do you mean? What were the main problems from Turkish side?
Yeah, from Turkish side. Could Turkey succeed to uphold the deal in every term?
Well, there were many agreements with Turkey. For instance, to introduce visa for Syrians coming from Lebanon and Jordan. So in 2015, we saw that a lot of Syrians who were living in Lebanon and Jordan, who had to flee there, were traveling through Turkey to the EU. This stopped because Turkey introduced the visa requirement. We also see that Turkey changed and made a temporary protection law to make sure that, of course, Syrian refugees get a protection under international law. Of course, there were less citizenship given to Syrian refugees, as was promised at the beginning. But I think if we look at the region, how Jordan and Lebanon, for instance, are dealing with refugees, then I think that that in Turkey, the situation for many of these refugees are better. Of course, we also saw problems, just like you see now how we deal with this question. It's not always in line with international law. We heard stories which also were confirmed by human rights organizations, how especially during the summer, illegal pushback started from Syrian people living in Turkey into Syria. Of course, we also see that Turkey itself is keeping the border closed to refugees who are now fleeing from Idlib. I always say it's difficult morally to point a finger at Turkey if you see that we are ourselves also closing the border. But I think, of course, these two elements, Turkey is doing the same as the EU is doing actually right now at the moment. So, it's not like one of the two sides has a perfect story. But I always find it hypocritical just to point the finger at Turkey and not to say what we are doing wrong ourselves.
Right now, the only genuine conversation or communication between the European Union and Turkey is about the migrants. Does this disappoint you?
Well, yes. I mean, I remember when this deal was made in 2016. Remember, this was the time that we already started seeing a lot of, especially your colleagues, journalists being arrested. This was the time that we saw the repression really starting inside Turkey. Of course, it started more or less around 2013 with the Gezi protest. But amidst the deal being signed by EU leaders, we had some very, very serious human rights abuses happening inside Turkey. And what the EU did was stop mentioning, looking the other way when it comes to democracy and Turkey. And I think that was very, very disappointing for many Democrats in Turkey to see that the EU is only interested when it has a problem itself, namely a lot of refugees coming, and is not interested when Democrats in Turkey are facing very serious issues themselves. So yes, this was a big problem in 2015 and 16, and I hope we don't fall into the same trap. It is needed to find a new agreement with Turkey, but based on the real European values that we stand for, and that means you can never be silent about human rights abuses, but you must also show yourself that you are also in line with these European values. And if we now look at what's happening at the Greek border, I, as a European citizen, feel ashamed.
Thank you, Ms. Piri.
Thank you very much. And hello to all the viewers.
It was great talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for watching us.